case study on missional theology and practice-led research. As I indicated in the part one of this week's lectures, this is a research project that is an ongoing one by one of our current students, and I did ask him. He's one of my students, and I suppose you'll probably be able to figure out who he is. I'm sure you guys talk about your projects, and so it's not really a secret. Franz Mirza in Kincardine, his church is the Harbor, and so I asked. We've been working through his project and what he's doing, and although he's not in this class, I was thinking, what he's doing is very much it's a PLR, but it also reflects the categories, the concerns of missional church and missional theology. So I thought it might be an interesting case study for thinking about the intersection of sort of missional theology and practice-led research. And so the research, the practice-led topic, if you will, of this project is how do we embody the gospel in Kincardine in a way that promotes church renewal that leads to missional vitality? How do we do that? How do we promote, bring about a revitalization of the church that leads to missional vitality? That's the practice that he's concerned with. And so then we started thinking about, well, what resources do you need to address that type of a topic? What resources will help you describe your church setting, because that's an important part. And then to answer that question, in church, like what kind of church are we revitalizing? What does church revitalization mean to your church tradition? And then we also have to look at, well, what about the culture, the society? I mean, if you want to do missional vitality in your context, well, what is your context? What is the nature of that context, and what would be considered vitality in that context? So that led to a number of conversations and ruminations, and so we basically came to several different points that I've organized into here for our consideration. And the first step was to think about context, and you have an ecclesial context, obviously, that you need to think about. And so, in terms of missional missional theology, one of the critical elements of the missional church, missional theology, is to understand your context, understand cultural context, and that involves not just the world out there, but also the church, the ecclesial context. And the ecclesial context has essentially two dimensions for this church in Kincardine. One is what we call macro ecclesial context, and that is the story of the church in North America, Canada in particular, over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And that is a story that a lot of people say is one of decline and the demise of Christendom. And so then, what resources would I look at to describe and explain that? Well, those people you've probably read and know: Bibby, Kevin Flatt, Joel Thiessen, Michael Wilkinson, Sam Reimer, and you obviously use Stats Can, and there's, I'm sure, other figures and sources that you could use to talk about that. So that's a fairly easy, probably, literature to identify and resource. But then you also have a micro ecclesial context, and that is your own particular church tradition. And in this case, it's a Pentecostal church, a PAOC church. And so what do you need to do to sort of unpack your own Pentecostal identity? Do you need to tell the history of the Pentecostal movement in Canada from the beginning to now? What do you need when you talk about church revitalization or a move of the Holy Spirit that will spark missional renewal? What does that mean in your specific setting? How do you describe revival, if you will, church renewal in the Pentecostal church? How far do you need to go? What how wide do you need to go in terms of describing what that is? So, and then you may say, well, really my concern is not to chart the history of the Pentecostal movement and Pentecostal revivals and all the ins and outs of that. Or you may say, my primary concern is the wider context of the cultural context and what that means for embodying effective mission in the world. And so you may see that the other major culture or contextual question, the cultural one, is more important than the micro ecclesial one. But at any rate, it's something that needs to be considered when you think about answering a question of practice, because that practice is always taking place in the particularities of a context, which will have multiple levels and influences. And so part of sifting through your method and what you're going to do is thinking about those contextual questions and what you have to address and what needs to be given more or less consideration. So in the cultural context, of course, it's Canada, it's Ontario, Canada, North America, and that's the macro level. And so then you want to think about, well, what do I need to talk about? If I'm talking about renewing the church for missional vitality in the world and society, what do I need to? What are the aspects of our culture that would be relevant to that? Well, maybe it's the postmodern aspect, that maybe that presents certain challenges to effective embodiment of the gospel. The secular culture, that wants to push out, keep religion, keep Christianity out of the public space. The multicultural dimension. How do we proclaim Christ in a world that ostensibly claims multiculturalism and such? And then it's religiously plural. How do we engage in a way that is committed to the gospel, but also operating in a culture that seems that it not seems but is religiously plural and is embraced sort of intellectually the ethos of religious pluralism, in which case the Christian claim for Christ becomes essentially problematic. So then you want to identify. You'll have to say, well, what sort of resources would I need to talk about postmodernism? Do I need to talk about Derrida, Gadamer, and blah blah blah, or sort of the philosophical sort of discussion and all the technicalities and ins and outs of that, or am I really, what's important are the more popular pop cultural manifestations of postmodernism, how that's affecting lifestyle practices, consumer preferences, attitudes towards healthy living, recreational pursuits, bougie eating. These are really the kind of the things that shape and influence the lives of everyday people. And these are the aspects or the manifestations of postmodernism that are significant for embodying the gospel in the community of Kincardine. These are just possible. I'm not saying they are, but these are the types of things you think about. Secularism. What do I need to talk? What is important about secularism for being missional in our community? Do I need to talk about the history of secularization, how it came about, and how that connects to the demise of Christendom? Do I need to go into the philosophical assumptions? Or is it the sociological dimensions of secularization or the political dimensions of secularization that are important? And then we ask similar questions about multiculturalism and religious pluralism, etc. And then you have the micro context of Kincardine. It's part of Ontario, it's part of Canada, it's part of North America. So there's a lot of similarities that you will find between Kincardine and almost anywhere else you'll go in the wider society. But it's also a unique place. It's a particular place, and it's influenced by its economy is largely based on the nuclear energy power plants. The demographics are unique because of that. Highly educated, just transplanted professionals, university educated. So that's gonna give a unique nuance to that micro context relative to being somewhere else. Doesn't mean that it's totally different and living in Hamilton or Toronto or this or that, but it's a particular place, and you're embodying the gospel in that particular place, and so you have to think through not only sort of the larger macro cultural issues, but the particularities of the place, and what do I need to describe that? Do I need to, describe my own experience? To describe the Kincardine, you can think about this, describing the history of the town, the developments in the town, what's happened in our particular, in that particular place. What about our church? What is the history of our church in this place? And is it in decline? And why is it in decline? What's been happening? What are the experiences of the other churches in the community? So you might interview other pastors or ministry leaders. Do their experiences match your experience, your church's experience? Or maybe there's a church that actually is undergoing renewal and revitalization. But you may say, well, is that what they count as renewal and revitalization? Is that what we would count as revitalization? Maybe it isn't. Maybe it is. Maybe there's something to learn. Maybe there's not. But those are the things that you want to think about. You want to consider how your microculture shapes your PLR topic, the resources that you would need to address it, the local ones, and what are the implications of those things for embodying the gospel in an effective way? In other words, given the particularities of our context, what does that mean for exercising pastoral leadership that promotes church renewal and missional vitality? So those things we want to bring together to answer that question. And then there will be, at some point, a turn to theology. You'll want to resource biblical elements. How does the Bible describe the work of God? What is the Bible, from Scripture? How would we understand what renewal looks like? Cultural engagement, what does it look like from a biblical perspective? Theological resources, are there veins of theological research that speak to church renewal, church revitalization, missional engagement? And then so you may need to draw on several strands of that. And then historical sources. It's like that should be C, historical. There have been other examples of growth, decline, renewal, perhaps, in the history of the church. You might want to look at those. Early Puritans, for example, by the second and third generation, they're already bemoaning sort of the loss of the original fervor. In other words, there's already a decline narrative once you get into the second and third generation of Puritans, right? The fervor of the first generation had been lost. Early Pentecostals, within the Pentecostal movement, you have a decline, sort of growth decline narrative that's already taken place, where the early fervor and commitment and zeal and exuberance of the first generations has now been largely lost, and Pentecostal churches have become middle class, upper middle class, urbane, and rather tame compared to their forerunners. So answering the PLR question, probably want to, in the pursuit of that, you want to probably consider other solutions. You're probably not the first person to given this question and this topic consideration. So you want to see what others have said. You will also want to develop your contribution. How does our church, or whatever your particular setting? I realize not everybody is in a church ministry position, but in your setting, in your a domain of trying to embody Christian living, Christian leadership, Christian ministry, whatever label, whatever it is, whatever the practice is that you're doing, how do we embody the gospel in our place, considering all the variety macro, micro cultural considerations that helps us to achieve a better way of embodying the gospel to and for our world. So that's essentially the contribution that you're looking for. And I've said this in a number of classes, and so if you've been in a class before, you can ignore this. Oh, here he goes on his little thing again. But in terms of answering your practice-led question and finding your own contribution to the larger discussion, I want to encourage you to notice what you notice. We are conditioned to depreciate and denigrate our insights and our ideas, and I think academic work kind of it's intimidating. Oh, Dr. So-and-so who's done research X, Y, and Z and flies here and to and fro to do papers and such, and I'm reading, his or her book, and it's so brilliant. Look at all those footnotes. How could I ever? And so we become intimidated. We think, these are the geniuses among us, and how dare I have anything to say to this conversation? And I want to just encourage you to disabuse yourself of that sort of an attitude. Now, I don't want you to become petulant and arrogant, and every thought that flies through your head you think is, touched with the spark of genius. That's not what I'm suggesting either. But don't get into this pseudo humility where you think you have nothing to say and you have nothing to contribute, and how could I ever do anything worth a dime? You need to just slough that off, and so notice what you notice. You as an individual are created in the divine image. There is no one who has been, is, or will ever be that is the unique manifestation of the divine image that you are. No one will embody the Spirit's breath of life in the way that you can. No one can be in and for this world the package of God's grace that you can be. Now, that doesn't mean that you're better than other, because everybody has that capacity, because we are all created in the divine image, and we are all blessed with the breath of life, and we are all called to bring that life to its particular manifestation in the fullness of the Spirit. And so I want to encourage you to do that in respect to your practice-led topic. And part of that is noticing. Like, you're going to see things. You're going to find synergies and connections and insights that no one else will see, because you bring a particular personal experience, concerns, backgrounds, whatever, and no one else has that package. And so you're going to notice things that no one else does. And so you need to attune yourself to hear those and pay attention to them and to follow them and to develop them. Because often it's that which will become your contribution to the wider field. And so I encourage you to do that. And that brings this section to a close. Next week you have you'll be posting your one of your assignments on Padlet, and I look forward to reading those and then joining with you the following week in our class sessions together.